Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today we are here with Philip Colvin, a leading specialist in the field of licensing, working across the spectrum of regulatory control, including alcohol, entertainment, sports, gambling, transportation, and adult entertainment. Philip has served as a keynote speaker at many RHI events, as chair of the London Mayor's Nighttime Commission, and on the boards of Purple Flag and Best Bar None.
Philip, this is such an honor to have such a distinguished orator engaging in a lively discussion about what's going on and how things have changed since you were last. You were speaking in New York, but in Seattle, I think that was one of your most brilliant speeches, and it really emphasized this whole kind of market force trend. And now you have your manifest, which has occurred between then and today. So I really want to focus on that as well as some other topics. But just briefly, for those who don't know you, explain your background and how you came to be in this position to be the prognosticator of the evolution of the social nighttime economy.
Very kind introduction, Jim, and I hope I can live up to it. So I'm a licensing barrister by profession. I've got the advantage of having worked on the local government and government side. So I'm interested in policy and I'm interested in regulation, but I've also worked on the industry side. So I understand what the commercial pressures are in industry. And during my time doing this, I've been the chair of the Institute of Licensing, which is our professional body. I'm now a patron of it. I was chair of Purple Flag, which accredits safe, welcoming, diverse and accessible centres of the nighttime economy. I've been chair of the Best Bar None scheme. I'm currently on the board of the Loop, which promotes drug testing in city centres and festivals. I'm on the board of a theatre, and I've written various books on the topics of alcohol, entertainment, gambling, sex licensing, and all sorts of other things. So I do like to stay involved.
Mhm.
And as part of that, I've been out to the States a number of times to your wonderful summits. And you were very kind to speak well of what I said in Seattle in 2020. But I wish that was all my own thinking. Actually, what you asked me to do there was to summarize what everyone else had been talking about. And that's what I did. And you get such a wonderful group of people who come together from all sides of government, industry, community protection, and so on, and increasingly international speakers. So what that really was a cocktail of all the influences which were happening during the summit, with a little bit of a Philip Colvin slant on it, because I'm
Yeah.
interested in the dynamic of the social economy.
Reflecting back on that, at that time, March 2020, right before, Dow Constantine came up after you, and he was the one that announced the first fatalities in the US and said, when you return home, life at night will never be the same. So what do you remember at that point before this idea of COVID was there? What was your vision? What were you anticipating the evolution of town centers and nightlife? You mentioned demographic trends, and you mentioned the adaptation of businesses to what was going on and the competition that they faced, not from each other, but from societal trends. Do you
Yeah,
recall that? And can you kind of paint a picture of what it was before that moment in time?
definitely. And let me just share one screen. It's only a slide I want to use during this whole interview, and it's this one. And what I could see at that time was that young people were not drinking as they used to. And if you look back to 2018, the curve really starts to pick up. So at that point, about 25% of young people were not drinking. By 2020, it was 35%. By 2021, it was 38%. And so I was looking at this trend and thinking, look, post-war, we flooded out town centres with pubs and bars. And then a bit later on, nightclubs began to challenge pubs and bars, and they fought back a little. But I thought, well, what about the future in which young people are not drinking? What's that going to do to the nighttime economy, which is very much alcohol fueled? And so at that time, I was thinking very much about the social economy, the experiential economy being the driver of town and city centres at night. But then along came this missile of COVID, and we all left. We all left Seattle really rather scared. I think we couldn't get out fast enough. And when I got home, I found that suddenly nobody was making license applications at all. The market was completely dead. Everyone was terrified. No one knew what the future of the world was. So I started thinking a bit about what life was going to be like. And then, so my two main themes at that time were first, when you get really ill and you're in accident and emergency and then intensive care, when you're free of the illness, you don't just skip free and sprint down the street. There's a really long process of rehabilitation. And I thought we were focused very much nationally on, oh, let's get through this virus and then everyone will be okay. I never thought that was going to be the case. And secondly, I began to row in ideas about climate change and sustainability and the things which actually do preoccupy young people. And so I began to wonder, what would an ethical social economy look like? And I thought we needed to get away from the term nighttime economy because it's so loaded. And I thought we should talk more about the social economy, which is basically everything we do when we're not at work, or even sometimes I'll say social ecology, you know, going and buying a pint of milk at night, or meeting a friend in the street, or having a walk in the park is all part of the socializing influence of towns and cities. And if I do use the word sociable, I use it because I've plagiarized it from the RHI, and you know I'm not proud about where I get my influences from. So we're now 2023, and a lot of my predictions have come true. It was an appalling um, obviously an appalling virus and appalling illness for the world, but it was a really shocking thing to happen to the people I represent and work with. Some of the bigger chains have managed to survive, and even post-pandemic have thrived because they've got great balance sheets and they can ride out the storm. I mean, if 1 in 10 of their premises closes, not to worry, the other 9 will survive. But if you're a little music venue, if you're a small bar, or you've sunk your whole life savings into that beautiful little gastropub, and suddenly, as is true of so many operators across the UK, your costs are up 40%, commodities, foodstuffs, energy, and all that, while your footfall is down 15%, your business plans are out of the window. Meanwhile, you've borrowed money during COVID. Sometimes you've borrowed money from the government, and now it's got to be paid back at interest rates, which are still very high in the UK. And what we're seeing is a sort of bifurcation of the big chains who can afford, who've got the resilience to handle what's going on, and the small operators who don't have that resilience at all. They've got nothing. And that worries me greatly because it's the small operators who tend to be younger, they're the young entrepreneurs, they're the creatives, and they're at the cutting edge of grassroots culture. Sometimes they're at the vanguard of the counterculture. And I think about, you know, when I grew up, I wasn't worried about this sort of stuff, but I do worry about our kids who, you know, lost years of socializing during COVID, lost time from their education, didn't get those wonderful rites of passage of going to pubs and bars and on dates and all of that sort of stuff. And I just think we've got a duty to support young people when they're setting off in business and when they're attending these sorts of venues. And so I've begun to think more about what we can do as a society to help these kinds of venues survive. Because once they've gone, it'll be a very, very long time before a new wave and a new generation is in a position to start up. So, in fact, that's a potted account of how my feelings have been moving over the last 3 years.
I mean, that's very much on point, you know, with some of the things that I've been seeing. And I know you have your manifesto, and we'll be talking about that. And I know there's some focus on government and the role of government, but you also have the focus on placemaking, which really is the big popular trend among um, urban planners, developers, business improvement district leaders, and that placemaking is almost trying to revitalize the dead zones because of the lost office workers, and there's that movement to convert empty offices into residential housing, which is sorely missing in a lot of cities. And I've reviewed some of that work, and even I was just in Fort Worth, where they're talking about this whole idea of more hotels, more condos, more apartments, and more kind of fine dining restaurants. And when I hear that placemaking world, it seems to emphasize placemaking for a certain class of people and not necessarily the young adults, because they're often saying, well, we don't want nightlife. We don't want late night establishments. We don't want that noise that disturbs the people who are buying our expensive condos. So we're not going to allow for those late night places. But it's that young adult, that 16 to 25-year-old group that you identified, that work in these nice fine dining restaurants or in the hotels or in the retail stores that everybody wants to stay open until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. So come 10 o'clock at night, when everybody says, well, we've had our fun, we've gone to our nice restaurants, we have the money to spend on fine dining, and we want to go home and go to bed, and we expect everybody who served us and cooked for us and were in the shops, they should go home and go to bed at 10 o'clock at night too. So where do you see this kind of placemaking that becomes more equitable instead of just focused on a daytime clientele and an early evening dining older adult with money clientele, leaving out some of those creatives that you're talking about? And what's the role of government to say, well, this is all important, but somehow or another, we have to think more broadly and equitably about social spaces?
So the two terms that you've used there are placemaking and equity. So let me just talk about that. First thing is, if I go out in London and I buy a pint of beer, I'm liable to be charged about £6 for that pint of beer. Now, in this city, a young person might earn, for the sake of argument, 16 or £1,700 a month. And they'll be very lucky now if they can get a room in a house for £800 a month. So half of their income will be going on their rent, which is inequitable. And on top of that, they've got to pay their transport into work, they've got to buy their food, they've got to buy their clothing, they've got their energy costs, etc. They don't have a lot left. And so the attraction of going out to a pub and spending £6.50, £6 on a pint is limited. But for that £6, they could probably buy themselves about a week of Champions League football or Netflix. And they can stay at home and drink beer at £1, £1.50 a pint. And so do we care about that? If we don't care, it's fine, because we can allow everyone to have their entertainment at home. The city centres, as you say, will become full of condos and the kinds of facilities which sort of older, wealthier people want to go to. And the nurses and the teachers and the bus drivers and all of those sorts of people, they can disappear off to the far-flung suburbs and leave the city centres to the rich. And if that's the sort of society we want, that's fine. That's a political choice. And we can do it. Now, as it happens, I don't agree with that. I think that it's desperately, desperately important that we have our city centres as places of sociability and community. But if we're going to do that, then we've got to acknowledge the fact that not everyone can afford to be in city centres. So we've got to make places that people want to come to and they can afford to come to. And I think it's so desperately important in this world now. We're seeing sort of campus debates in the US, which are rather sectarian. We're seeing similar debates across Europe. We're seeing wedges driven between people of different social classes, different races and ethnicities. And I feel so strongly that the future of humanity is based on a more collective understanding. And I think that young people have got the ability to do so much better than our parents did in understanding people of different nationalities and ethnicities. And we need to keep that driving on. So when it comes to placemaking, the only people who can make places in city centres, across city centres, are government. That's the first big thing. The second big thing concerns equity. So, how are we going to provide the kinds of facilities that everybody can use? By that, we might mean playgrounds in parks. We might say to ourselves, look, not everyone can afford a garden. So where do kids go to play when they come home from school in the autumn, when the lights are down? Are our playgrounds lit? Are our streets safe? Can people pop out and get a pint of milk? Can people talk to their neighbours safely on the underground train or in the street? So how are we going to create places which are communal, which are affordable, and which are sociable? And again, this comes down to how these towns and cities are planned. Now, simultaneously with that, we never used to worry about the market. Because the market brought forth what it was going to bring forth. It brought forth pubs, it brought forth nightclubs, it brought forth whatever else, casinos, lap dancing clubs, and all the gaiety of life which happens in town and city centres. But now we're in a situation where those drivers of town and city centre life have become patients in need of resuscitation. And so we've now got to ask ourselves, what do we value? And if we value this stuff, if we value a music venue, if we value a street market, if we value a concert hall, we might just have to pay for it. And we might need to say that, like other things which don't necessarily pay for themselves, like drains or education or public parks, we've got to use some of our public money and our public influence to make sure that we've got the right balance for everybody. So this now does become a matter for the state. And I think more than any time since I've been involved in this world, it's not a question of the state saying, oh, we're very worried about all this alcohol in the nighttime economy, we must control it. We're now at the point where the government needs to say to itself, well, do we care about sociable cities? And if we do care, then we might need to ask ourselves, how can we support them? So that's about placemaking, and it's about equity. So the debate is shifting on.
So what I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that if we were to think about how people socialize and really working towards a kind of an umbrella of a sociable city, we can't just think about the venues as being the deliverer of the ones that deliver that social space. That the social space expands beyond those venues, and the sociability can begin even just with those social connections that are important in our daily lives. We think about our friends and our family as our social connections, but how many of us really get to know the people who run the local Chinese restaurant, or the dry cleaner when we bring our clothes to the dry cleaner? So how do we maintain those social connections? And what you're saying is that there's that interconnectivity that occurs. I want to take my dog for a walk at night, or if I want to have my kids in the playground, we're making social connections with other parents who have their kids in the playgrounds. And we could talk about some of the challenges our kids are facing in school and get advice from other parents. Or it's the time we spend on the public transportation, waiting for the train or the bus, and we interact with the people that we're waiting on our way to go to a pub or a nightclub or a restaurant. So sociability actually extends beyond the home and the venue There's a lot of interactions, and they all require the same focus on safety, convenience, equity, access, everything that kind of makes all of that connectivity happen between our
Yes.
home and our social spaces.
And I'd add to that beauty, by the way. We want our public places to be beautiful, and I think we should be sort of arguing and advocating for this. You're absolutely right to say it can't just be the home and the venue, but for a whole bunch of reasons. The one is that a certain number of people will accumulate in a venue, but what gives a town and city its atmosphere is the street life, it's the pageantry. I've been to New York a few times, but this last time I nearly wore my shoes out and walked, and the whole city's a pageant. It's wonderful. You don't have to spend a penny. And it's all there. You move from one corner to another, and suddenly you're into a completely different neighborhood with its own life and its own vibe. And I think that's a hugely intoxicating thing. But I'd say two other things about that. The first is that since we've got parklets and eateries, we're now seeing more people just wanting to be outside, and for the socializing to happen outside. And we've seen that very strongly in London with pavement licensing, with whole streets worth of tables set out, and it's incredibly gay and happy and energetic. So that's the first thing, is we're sort of almost forced outside. But the other thing I want to say is that as the process of home entertainment just sort of takes root and grows, you've got to ask yourself, well, what would bring somebody off their sofa? What is it that you can do in your home that you can't do in a venue, and vice versa? So what is the magnetic force? And part of the magnetic force is to come to a communal and joyful place. And so I think of the things that I can think about. I leave out of account food, because people can always pay for great food that they wouldn't be able to cook themselves or don't have time. But listening to live music in a small venue is a kind of irreplaceable experience. You can't do that with headphones on a sofa. That intimacy you get with a performer is incredibly difficult to replicate in a living room, but it's also very expensive to put on. So we've got to support it. But the other thing that I'm seeing in England, and it's a definite trend, is that it's really difficult for the smaller nightclub to survive anymore, because young people are going either to massive warehouses for their entertainment, by which I mean 5, 7, 10,000 capacity warehouses, to listen to the biggest DJs in the world and have a huge sort of out of body experience, practically, with all the sweat and energy of that room and the extraordinary light shows and amazing sound systems. And also, kids wanting to premiumize are just saving up their money and going to festivals. But all of these things are talking about the power of place to attract people. And so, we've got to try and provide those places, not just for the people who can afford to do it, but also for people who can't. We've got to provide that joy and sense of communitarian experience for people who don't have the money as well. And the inequity we're now seeing in society, where so much of society's wealth is gathered in the hands of quite a few people, against such small amount of wealth gathered in the hands of the other about 50% of the population, is a very striking thing. And we cannot get to a situation where our nighttime ecology admits certain people and excludes others. It doesn't literally exclude them, but in the same way as I'm not excluded from the Ritz Hotel. I can get in it as long as I've got money. It's free to everybody if they've got enough money to pay for it. We can't create town and city centres on that basis. We've got to try and provide for everybody. That's the task.
Yeah, we have about 8 minutes left, but I wanted to ask you, from what you're saying, what I hear you saying anyhow, is that there's a market for certain types of activity that's very profit oriented and very much built around large volumes of people. But then there's another market of the small independent music venues that really are kind of catalyst to developing the talent, those DJs that play in a small, 200 occupancy venue, who grow up to become the DJ that makes 250,000 a night in a 5,000 occupancy warehouse event. So
Totally, and
that
I'm just going to take 15 seconds to say, and that also means you're absolutely right about that ecology, but the ecology starts in school.
Mhm.
We got our arts education right, and if someone wants to be a DJ, where do they get their education? Are the
Mhm.
apprenticeships out there? So all of this becomes a question for the state to make sure that ecology is functioning well.
Right. So putting it into an equity perspective and the role of government and the role of private foundation investment, um, symphonies who basically are narrowly defined to a certain class and a small sector of the community receive incredible subsidies from government and from foundations. What I hear you saying is maybe there needs to be some mechanism that can be equally applied to support the small independent venues that help the musicians who one day grow into symphony performers, but also that provide an opportunity for the non kind of cultural wealthy class, but really one that's just getting started in that creative sector. So is what you're saying is how can we carve out a specialized government role that not necessarily is socialist in a way to take over the small venues, but to accommodate those small venues in the same way that we accommodate the symphony or the opera house, to allow for these smaller venues to exist in some subsidized way. Is that a direction you see going?
It's important. It's happened to a degree in London. There's a jazz club called the 100 Club on Oxford Street where they got special rates treatment, and that's one way you might help a club like that. In Berlin, the very famous club Berghain was given the same cultural status as the Opera House, which gave it various fiscal advantages. But it's incredibly small amounts of money help out the smallest performance venues, and so the Music Venues Trust here has created a sort of charitable fund, which allows them to take over places so as to protect the tenants from raising rents. We've imported the agent of change from the United States, and that ought to protect music venues against incoming occupiers complaining about nuisance. So this isn't, I don't think anyone's just talking about massive handouts. People are talking about the creative ways which we can support these cultural venues. But the starting point, and I use this expression quite a lot, about which is popular culture. We're incredibly good at supporting high culture. We're less good at recognizing and supporting popular culture. So the starting point is a way of recognizing that something is culture, even if that's not the first word you'd reach for.
Hmm. Okay, this is the final section. Then we have to end this conversation. We continue after, but um, when you spoke in Seattle, you drew attention to Alicia Scholler, who works for us, and 3 times you pointed out her presentation that was really focusing in on women's safety, restrooms, women as consumers, and all of that other stuff. And when I spoke with Peter Marks, Peter, and he was talking about the trends that he sees in terms of his employees and women managers and women security and the increasing role and the way they approach their jobs and their roles differently. In all of this discussion, where do you, and even with the night manager movement, it's still predominantly a male focused endeavor, and most social venues are male developed. Where do you see the evolution of women and how they begin to sit at the table, whether it be better playgrounds for their children or more worker opportunities with support for them working late in the evening where they might not be able to because of lack of ways to care for their children? Where's the focus where does the focus have to be on the future of women in management, leadership, and as consumers?
So the one thing I remember Alicia saying at that summer, she said lots of great things, but the one thing I remember her saying is planned for women, men will follow. So there's a commercial imperative for venues to get themselves right for women, to create environments which are attractive to women. I think this is really important stuff. In England, we've got repeated allegations about spiking of drinks, women waking up in beds that aren't their own. and therefore the growth of WAVE training in England, which is welfare and vulnerability engagement training, where you're trying to create an active bystander approach in venues so that people are really on the lookout for someone who might be vulnerable without just allowing them to walk out on wobbly legs. In the security industry, it's incredibly difficult to employ women, but you need to have women at venues because you need women searching women. You need women who understand the needs of women. And so when we get to the sort of management level and the night manager and the night mayor level and all of that sort of thing, women have got a really crucial role to play. The one is because they are almost certain to have a better understanding of the needs of women. And I don't know if am I allowed to characterize women also in this way, that in my own experience, that when women are in leadership positions, they take a more collaborative and empathetic approach than men sometimes take, who try and lead from the front, and that's not always the best way to lead. Why hasn't this happened? I think it's something to do with the industry. It's just, you need someone working till 2 or 3. You look around people who are managing venues across the country, and they tend to be men because men can get away with it. And that means that when people are advertising for night mayors and that sort of thing, it tends to be men who are making the applications. Now, this is not to say that there are not women in the night sphere. I brought Carly Heath to New York because I thought this was a global leader for women in the future. And I think she made a great impression, and she's coming to Dallas next year, which I'm deeply thrilled about. I thought Ariel did a fantastic job in New York and in Sydney. There's a woman called Libby Harris, who I think is a sort of stunning performer, the way she's managed to turn Sydney around from a place that had its lockdown laws to a place which is really looking forward to the future. So I think, like all these sort of diversity exercises in jobs, you can't just sit around and hope that it's going to happen. It's not going to just happen. History has proved it doesn't just happen. You've actually got to go out there actively and mentor and recruit people into the top roles. And I think that, women have got a huge role to play in nighttime governance in the future. But, you look around our senior boards of our public companies in the UK, there are very, very few women leading them. That's not because of anything other than the way history has been. And we're going to have to go out and be much more active in bringing women on through the industry. And if we do, we will all benefit from that.
All right. Well, that sounds like a great concluding comment, Philip. And this has been a brilliant conversation. At least your brilliance shines through. And I want to thank you for everything you've done. And I know you're not planning to come to Dallas, but we certainly hope we could persuade you to change your mind, because I'm sure many people would love to visit with you again. But thank you again for all of your insights, and wish you luck in whatever endeavor you pursue.
Very much, Jamie. I really hope to be over that side of the water sooner rather than later.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.